The grease pencil is an awesome tool in Blender that we can use for a lot of different applications. It's useful for quickly jotting out sketches of things you might model. It's useful for taking notes. In recent releases of Blender, it's now become quite a cool little animation tool as well unto itself. We're not going to get a lot into the animation bits of the grease pencil. We'll save that for another tutorial down the road. So the easiest way to use the grease pencil is just by holding down the V key on your keyboard, then just start drawing. And we immediately have these strokes. And so if I then go to rotate my screen, we see that our sketch has been manifested in the middle of the screen. So I could rotate the screen around, hold V, draw some more with my left mouse button or just by clicking down with my stylus or my tablet. So there's several ways we can get rid of these strokes that we just made. First of all, if we hadn't made very many, we could of course just tap Control or Command Z if you're on a Mac, just several times until they're all gone. But say we had been sketching something out here. Another way to get rid of this is if we press T to bring up our tool shelf and property shelf. Over here on the right, you'll notice this option here called Grease Pencil. And if we click the little arrow to display all the options, you'll see a bunch of things here. But right here in this box, and we can of course click this box up and down to expand it, this is where our Grease Pencil layers are. And so this default layer is just called GP layer here, but you could rename that just like you can anything in Blender. You could just double click on it and call it My Layer or something. But we can hide the visibility of our grease strokes by clicking this eye icon, or we can just get rid of it by selecting it here and then pressing the minus sign, and then it is gone. So these scene and object buttons here, what these are asking is, what should our grease pencil layer be attached to? Should it be attached to the entire scene? That is everything in our main 3D view. And of course you can delete and create scenes up in the info header bar. So if we click on this button here next to scene, we see that there's only one scene just called scene. But if we were to add another scene, we could just click new here. And then say I were to start holding V and drawing in this other scene, which I'll just go ahead and rename this other scene to be a little more descriptive. Because we have this attached to the scene, this grease pencil layer that we drew on will only show up in this scene. So if I click on my scene selection button and we click back on the first scene, notice there are no layers. The other option is that we can attach these grease pencil layers to objects. If I were to select object and then press V and start drawing, because this was selected to object, then that means whatever my selected object was, these grease pencil layers will be attached or associated with that object. So for instance, over here in my outliner, if I were to turn off the visibility of that cube, since we had this set to object, all grease pencil layers are also hidden because they are associated with that object. And when I clicked here to turn it back on, we don't see it because you have to actually have the object selected when you have the layers associated with the object as opposed to associated with the scene. So unless you have a particular reason to have your grease layers be associated with an object, typically keep that on scene. So there's several different ways in which we can use this grease pencil. If over here in our properties shelf we select this grease pencil tab, we have an entire tab here dedicated to some more grease pencil options. We have our basic methods of drawing the grease pencil stroke on. When we hold V and just start drawing, that is just the basic draw there. So if I were to just click draw, it sends us into grease pencil mode, and you can see that as denoted by the little paintbrush icon. If you click and start drawing and then let go, that finishes that grease stroke. So if you had to do that every time you wanted to make a grease pencil stroke, that would get a little bit annoying. So there's the option to enable continuous drawing. So if we click that and then select a draw method, such as draw here, then we can draw and then say rotate the view around and continue drawing. However, in this mode, almost everything else is not available to us. For instance, if we try to do a precise zoom with our tablet pen or our mouse, it's going to knock us out of that drawing mode, and we can't do things like go into orthographic views and stuff like that. So it's very kind of limited. So that's why in general we keep this unchecked, and whenever we want to make a stroke, we just hold down V, and this allows us to quickly navigate around, use any buttons we want, jump into any view we want, and always have really quick immediate access to the grease pencil because it's such a really powerful, useful tool. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure this layer here is selected and click this minus sign to delete all of that. And I'm going to go ahead and set this association type back to scene because I want my grease strokes to just be free on their own in this scene and not be attached to any one particular object. So over here, going down in these options, we have line. So if we were to click line, if you click at a position and then hold your mouse down and drag this line out, you can create a grease stroke anywhere that you want. And this is kind of similar to the old MS Paint style of line tool here. We could select erase. You can hold V and right mouse click or V and middle mouse click to also use. Finally, we have poly, which allows us to make multiple kind of straight lines and make them attached to each other. This one is really, really neat. If we were to click poly, this starts our grease pencil session. And rather than clicking and dragging, we can click a point and click another, and just create strokes however we want to, like this. Here's where this gets really cool. If you move around by holding your middle mouse button or pan your screen by pressing shift middle mouse, or zoom in and out by using the scroll wheel. Now keep in mind, we are in this dedicated grease pencil mode where basically all we can do is rotate, pan the view, and zoom in and out by scrolling. But doing that is really cool because it allows us to continue clicking and adding to the shape in multiple dimensions. So we could, keep doing all kind of stuff like this. And this shape just gets, more and more interesting because these lines continue to be connected to each other. So this is a pretty cool tool here as well. So we already discussed what these buttons do. These make it to where whenever we begin drawing, our new layer will be associated to either the entire scene or just particular objects. So these are just basically the same buttons you can control from either over here on the property shelf or the tool shelf. I'm going to go ahead and tap space to finish that poly. And you'll notice when I did that, my mouse went from the little brush shape back to the cursor shape there. And I'm going to go ahead and press the minus sign to delete that layer. Stroke placement. These four options are extremely useful. By default, we're set to surface. That just means that if you draw a grease stroke over any object, the grease stroke will conform to that object. So if I were to zoom in up here on my cube and hold V and start doing some strokes, and then I move over, we see that they are automatically conforming to the shape of this cube. So I could hold V, do a stroke like this, and when we go around, we'll see it actually contoured perfectly. And so if I were to press Shift A, and under Mesh, add a monkey, press S to scale, tap W a few times, to give it some smoothing, G to grab and bring it up, and we were to start drawing on this guy by holding V, it does that as well. And so you'll notice that these lines, we can see through them because by default they are set on X-ray, but you can of course turn that off here if you don't want to have those lines show up through your object. So we could do something like this, or this, and of course that all conforms to our object. Now keep in mind that the grease pencil and all these layers and strokes only show up in the 3D viewport. So these are not to be rendered with either Blender's default render engine or the Cycles render engine. For the most part, these tools are to aid you in visualizing what you want to accomplish or blueprinting something out. As I mentioned earlier, with recent versions of Blender, there are some now animation possibilities with them, which are really cool. The other really extremely useful function that we get out of grease pencil strokes is the ability to create mesh from our strokes, and we'll get into that in a later video as well. So above surface, we have the option for view, and view is really useful for making notes to yourself, or basically just being able to draw over Blender. Like say if you need to make a screen capture to send it to somebody, or you're giving instructions to someone, or even to yourself, View is really helpful for doing kind of note-taking stuff like that. So if we switch this to View, and I could change the color of my stroke from black to anything I want by clicking on this value, and then I'll just bring up the darkness, and then I could pick something like red here. And actually, I don't want all these previous strokes I was drawing on to be red here, so I'll press Control Z a few times to undo that color change, and I'll actually click the plus sign and add another layer. And since I've added another layer, I can now click on here, change the color to red or something. Now if I hold V and begin drawing, you see that this color is different from that one because we are on this different layer here. And notice too, because we've set the placement to View, that these strokes are stuck on the screen. Cursor is really useful when you're wanting to construct three-dimensional blueprints. So say for instance you wanted to quickly map out like what you wanted a castle or a house or something like that to look like. Cursor really helps you quickly create strokes that are in line with each other. So for instance, I could tap A to select everything, tap X to delete, and switch the stroke placement to cursor. And so whenever I make a grease pencil stroke, it's going to begin near the location of the cursor. So I could say press 5 to go into top view, maybe set this to continuous drawing so I can use this line tool real quickly, and then start here at the cursor, draw a line out, draw another one out, draw one here, draw one here. Say maybe I plan to have like an entranceway here or something. And then when I rotate around, I've got this basic floor part. Say I wanted to make a line coming straight up, but I wanted to start it here. The way I would do this is press space to finish that drawing session, and then press 5 to go into top view. And then of course, whenever we are in an orthographic view, such as top, right, left view, or whatever, we can right click and let go of the cursor and it will snap to any grid line. So we could put that there. Then we could press 1 to go into front view and select line again. And basically, when you have it set to cursor, Blender then knows what point in space that you're actually trying to start that new stroke. If we wanted to get something up here, we could press 1 to go into front view, and then once again, right click our cursor up here. And then we could press 4 to go into left view, and then we could click on this line tool again. And typically I don't use the continuous drawing, but for an application like this, it comes in handy a little bit. So I could press space to confirm that. And looks like I overshot that a bit, but no worries. We can actually edit these curves here. If we click on this edit strokes and press enable editing, then we have a lot of options that will actually help us manually edit our strokes. So I could press B to do a border selection and then select these two strokes here, which are only 2 points because we're using that nice line tool. Press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and just bring this back like this. I could also do something like do a border select of this whole kind of wall here and just come over here and press duplicate, press my middle mouse button to constrain that and bring that over. And so, really quickly we can, sketch up some ideas for something before we want to go all out and trying to, make it look really good with proper 3D objects and mesh and stuff like that. So I'm going to press minus sign once again to delete that layer. Finally, if we switch this over to stroke, stroke does its best to start your new grease pencil stroke as close as possible to wherever your last stroke left off. For instance, if I hold V and start, drawing something like this, and then I rotate around and come over here. If I were not on stroke, this would most likely, if I begin to draw from this point, Blender may not necessarily understand where I meant for this stroke to begin in 3D space, but if I come here and then press V, it understood pretty well and started that stroke near that point. To be honest, sometimes when I use this, it doesn't always connect these points properly. Right now it's working, so that's good. I mean, it usually does, but occasionally you may have to back up a few steps, Control Z. Yeah, it's working good right now. Maybe it's gotten better in the last few versions. Looks really good. These tools here convert. What this will do is, if I go ahead and tap space to finish up that drawing session, I'm going to go ahead and turn continuous drawing off. This will convert your grease layer that you have selected. All the strokes in that layer, it will convert it to either a path or a NURBS curve. And that's kind of halfway getting you to being able to convert this into a mesh. The grease pencil is a very kind of loose, free-form tool. So it's not always ideal to try to use the grease pencil tool to create a really good looking mesh. If I press convert here, we have a little option menu pop up and we could select polygon curve. Basically, we've now converted these strokes into a more mathematical curve here that's, getting closer to something that we could actually render in either Blender Render or Cycles. But as I mentioned before, there's another way to generate mesh from your grease pencil strokes that I think you might like a lot more. And then so we have this option for the ruler protractor, and this just allows you to use this ruler to figure out distances between two strokes or something, which may come in handy if you're doing a more technical creation or drawing or something like that. But I typically don't use that there. You can press escape to get out of that. One thing I should mention, when we went to convert our grease pencil strokes into this mathematical curve thing here, it didn't actually get rid of our grease pencil strokes or our layer. So we can actually turn off the visibility of that grease pencil layer. And so here is just the actual curve here that was generated. So I'm going to go ahead and close this edit strokes up here. And I'm going to go ahead and tap X to delete that curve we generated from our grease pencil layer. And then press the minus sign to go ahead and delete that grease pencil layer. I'm going to double right click over here and under mesh, add another monkey and zoom around, press S to scale, tap W 2 or 3 times there to give it some smoothing and switch this back to surface. I wanted to mention real quickly that if you have the stroke placement set to surface and you don't draw a grease pencil stroke on an actual object, then it will of course just go wherever in the 3D view. If I were to hold V and then just start drawing there, it wouldn't go particularly any specific location there. But then, of course, we can start drawing on this Suzanne head here. Under here, everything where it says frame 0 unlocked here, all the way down to this onion skinning stuff, and then this motion tracking is totally something different. But all this bit here, this has to do with animating your grease strokes, which we'll be getting into later. Between here and here, we have options. Of course, we have the stroke color, which we can change. We can change this layer to whatever we want. And of course, if we wanted multiple colors, we just add another layer and then, change this. And then when we hold V to start drawing, it will be whatever color we set that to. And then this fill by default, you see it says OP, that means opacity. If I were to drag this out, these are opacity meters. And by default, the fill opacity is set to 0. And that's basically just to give the illusion that when you're drawing these, you're just drawing the lines. But actually, at any time that you increase this opacity meter here, you can actually see the fill generated of your grease pencil strokes, which is really cool. And of course, you can also change the color for that. So we could increase this value and change this to something like this. And this is especially cool because we're using the surface stroke placement. It's mapped onto the side of the head. So once again, this is an extremely useful previs tool for quickly kind of jotting out sketches, designs, and things like that for actual 3D objects you may want to make. And now I mentioned that you can't actually render this with Blender Render or Cycles, but you can render it with OpenGL. Doing an OpenGL render is basically just rendering exactly what your graphics card is already producing anyway. That's why they basically take no time to render. So for instance, if I were to click this OpenGL render button here, we get basically a rendered flat image of exactly what the graphics card is already producing. In that sense, we can create pretty impressive layered images and animations using either the OpenGL image render or OpenGL animation render. which is pretty much the whole point of being able to animate with the grease pencil and grease layers and such, which we'll get into down the road. And so, you could save this image, or you could hide any objects, and of course just, use a totally grease pencil layer, a derived image, to do that. So I'll press go back here. We're kind of seeing these fill lines come through here on this because the opacity isn't all the way up, but if we had it all the way increased, it would look like that. We could turn off the X-ray. We would of course move to this other first layer, which is kind of brown here. We could increase the fill on this, and we see where the fill comes in, any kind of completed shapes we've done, change its color, move that up. And of course, if we want to go back and edit these, we can come to Edit Strokes, press Enable Editing, and use a selection method to select something we want, such as B for border select there, press S to scale, R to rotate, what have you. You can hold middle mouse to constrain just like you can with a regular object, and so on. So I know I introduced a lot to you today about the grease pencil, and it may seem a bit overwhelming, but all I really want you to take away from this for now is that you can hold V to draw grease strokes anytime that you want. You can, under this grease pencil heading here, you can press this minus sign to get rid of these layers if you don't want them there. And by default, whenever you hold V and start drawing some grease strokes, they will map onto the surface of whatever 3D object you happen to draw over them. So that's pretty much it for an introduction to the grease pencil. So play around with that, see if you can come up with some cool ideas. Coming up very soon, I'm going to be showing you how to use a really awesome object called the Draw Mesh object, which takes a really amazing advantage of the grease pencil in a really cool way. So if we were to press Shift A, and under this More option here, you see we have this Draw Mesh object. And so we'll be getting into that soon, so stick around.